Hello everyone, how you doing today? Thought I'd get a video out and play with some new stuff and show you some stuff, but the biggest thing is kind of relaying some information on a update that took place shortly after I made the video yesterday. This particular update made me quite happy. Um, Let me just show you something here. So here is the Persis Carrier CV2. Um, Unmodified except for the removal of RCS and the addition of some CPU blocks to bring it to tier 4. With the new numbers that have now been put into place, check this out. This class 10 CV, without gutting it or changing any of its functionality, features, guns, constructors, anything at all, is now 100% CPU efficient at tier 4. Now this is a class 10 CV, and actually it dropped three points, removing the RCS and making the changes to it. But I didn't gut it. I didn't kill the ship. I didn't remove all its parts. I didn't make it so it can't fly. I did remove the RCS, just like which was what was done with the Tashi. Same idea. Took out the RCS, put in 4 CPU tier blocks, and now my baby is CPU compliant. So I'm very happy about that. In fact, the CV tier CPU went, or tier 4 CPU went from 1.6 million to 10 million. So that's a pretty big, strong number increase. In fact, all the items went up, I believe, except maybe the bases. I have to check on that. But bases didn't have a problem in the first place, so it was very easy to build a base to be CPU compliant. But it wasn't so easy with SVs and CVs of larger sizes. So now it is. So now, no problem building a ship like this. In fact, I could probably build it a little bigger. Of course, there's always the class size thing too, and it's like what servers are going to allow. And every time I typically went above class size 5, I would have to keep that in mind. You know, if I wanted to build a bigger ship, I'd still watch the size class, but I was willing to go to 10 for quite a long time, and I've only built one item ever that's bigger than 10, and that's the Creel Overseer War Carrier. But that was because my intent was to build a alien mothership, and still, in my opinion, not big enough to be a mothership, so it became a war carrier instead. That's kind of pushing it, This is a pretty big ship. It's got a lot of room in it, a lot of carrying space, a big farm, big crafting area. I mean, just everything about it's kind of scaled up. And I mean, this still is probably my go-to ship for like late game, end game kind of ship, like something I would want to build in game presently. Just because I think it works pretty well, and it's got like everything I would want in a capital ship. On another note, I hit the drawing boards again because I got kind of motivated after seeing those numbers there. I was just like, oh, wait a minute, this is looking much better now. So I suddenly got some inspiration again. So I decided to revisit the dropship idea. Even though I probably wouldn't use it myself necessarily in gameplay due to the reasons I explained last time, doesn't mean as a designer that I don't want to design such a thing. It just means I might not use it myself, but I didn't want to get defeated on my first concept. So this is a newer one. It's scaled up a little bit more. Same general idea, but basically the big thing is I needed a solution to get into it, and that is by using these weird ramps going down the back. Now it doesn't have a lot of space inside this ship, but its focal purpose is to move HVs around and not really do a whole bunch more than that. And I think it would work at this point. It's far from done. I don't have a lot of the blocks in place, and it's a little funky looking, I think, with these big pieces coming down, and these look a little skinny over there and stuff. And I don't think I have enough surface area really to mount very big HVs on the bottom. But, you know, proof of concept, I think it could work. And yeah, pretty happy with that. So because of the numbers, I also wanted to take a look at HVs for the first time since the patch. And so I took, again, probably my favorite tank that I made to date, and that's the Demos. Now, this tank was made before weights and volumes, and before there was such a thing as the newer thrusters for HVs. So the HV max budget limit is at 70,000 now for Tier 4. As you can see the numbers here, I've got this tank to work with that. Now this tank wasn't a CPU tank to start with. Didn't care about CPU. It was just a tank, and built, you know, a couple versions of the game ago. So this one I did have to make some modifications to get it to fit in Tier 4. Of course, I did the standard thing of removing the RCS, adding the CPU block. So that was the first step done. But beyond that, it was still above by some. And what I ended up doing is removing a lot of the thrusters. Now this thing had an awful lot of thrusters on it, and it was kind of needed to move a big combat steel heavy tank around before. You just needed a lot of thrust to get that thing to move decently. So what I essentially did is remove like a row of thrust kind of all the way around the tank. So I took out quite a few really, and I also removed the two multi-turrets that were in this location back here. Well, with all that said, you know, how does it work? And I'll have to show you that on the Persis too. So as in moving this tank around, I would dare say that it operates pretty close to how it did originally with the RCS in place. My turning's not super wonderful, but it's all, you know, I'm using the arrow key here, so this is my max turning speed. It's not bad. Strafing on it's not bad either. And keep in mind, this is a heavy tank. A lot of guns on it. I think max guns on it actually. So it's a pretty big tank. I mean, there's bigger out there. There's bigger of everything out there. But simple point is it works just fine now, and I didn't have to kill it. You know what I mean? So I didn't have to like downgrade it to the point where I wouldn't want to have a tank like this. It would be too expensive and not, you know, perform very well. But now I'm pretty happy. I think this would perform nicely in game. It doesn't, of course, this version of the tank, it's older. It doesn't have the new weights and volume storage. It doesn't have the new tier thrusters that were made for HVs. These are still the original old ones. And this is just a minor concern. I was kind of looking at the parts, and I was thinking, well, hey, I'll just swap out some of these thrusters for the newer ones for HVs. And there's this whole new line of thrusters over here that weren't available when I made this tank. In fact, the best thruster I could put on it was this one here. Then I'm looking at the stats and the numbers on these. And I thought I was going to get a big increase by going to the newer thrusters. So if you take a look at the numbers here, you're looking at 180 CPU and 270 on force. And say I go to these other ones. Now this one's actually a downgrade. Thruster L is kind of a downgrade over what I already had on there. So a little bit less force, a little less CPU. Not really the one I'm looking for. The one I'm looking at is this one. And this one is slightly more CPU and slightly more thrust. But certainly not by much. In fact, swapping the thrusters out to this other level here, besides these have more hit points, isn't really going to do much for me with actual moving the tank around, I don't think. Because a little bit more CPU, slightly more thrust, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's just you're going to increase your hit points on your thrusters. So I'm still kind of at the same thrusters, and swapping them out to the newer tier I don't think is going to do much for me. But as it is, the tank works pretty good right now. I've got some wiggle room yet. Not much wiggle room. I could add a couple more thrusters back in. But without the RCS, it's working pretty decent now. I could probably actually take some of this available CPU I have left and maybe pop in. Kind of looks like about two, maybe. Oh, what are RCS? RCS are 600. So yeah, I could get it looks like about 2 RCS in here. I gotta try it. I just want to see if I notice anything different in how it performs with a couple RCS in here. Just dump them somewhere. Try to be somewhere around the center of gravity. Yeah, sorry about the secure cockpit for now. Okay, so we added a couple RCS. I just want to verify that it took that. Okay, so 2 RCS. CPU numbers are below 70,000, just barely. And did that really make much of a difference? I can't say I'm really noticing a difference by adding those 2 in here. Maybe just ever so slightly, but I think it seems to be operating about how it was prior. Maybe just a touch bit better. I'm sure there's some small amount that it's steering better at. But the fact is, though, this is possible with the tier system, which is making me pretty happy, because it's, again, this was not compliant to past CPU either. It wasn't even close. And the CV2 Persis, although optimized over the original version, still was far over the past CPU limits, simply because I didn't want to remove so much of it, and I wanted to keep the ship kind of intact to the original ship. But I designed at the time the chassis using less generators, bigger thrusters, less thrusters, and things like that to be a lot more optimized. In fact, if it didn't have all the storage and stuff and all the constructors in it, originally it was 7500 CPU compliant and would fly. It didn't have much room left over for fuel tanks or anything like that. But anyway, I think all this is really good news. And not to mention, in the last video too, I already noted that the flight model smoothed out a lot. Like on this ship over here, get some fuel in it. Now this one I didn't put any CPU blocks in yet, and it looks like I'm gonna have to do that right now actually. Let me get some tier 3 ones, but not for HVs. One sec. Actually, what are CPU tiers on SVs? This is a big change too. I believe tier 4 before topped out, I believe the number was at 48,000. So now it's at 100,000. That opens up a lot of possibilities. It really does. I don't feel like I'm sweating constantly trying to make anything anymore. I feel like I can kind of make the ships I would like to make, depending on their cost and what player unlock levels they're for and things like that. But having a limit of 100,000, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. That is not too limiting. And that's kind of why, and that's where I got the motivation to build this one with in the first place. Now currently I'm noticing this kind of thing again where some of the parts are invisible temporarily. I think there was some kind of immediate trick to have them show up, and I know restarting the session will fix that. This mostly went away, but it seemed to come back a little bit, at least in this version right now. So it's a bit glitchy with that at the moment, but I'm sure that's going to be addressed. But so we added in a couple of these tier 3 CPU blocks, and that brings me up to 40,000. So at tier 3, I've still got 15,000 or about 14,000 wiggle room on adding stuff to this ship. Now this ship already has its thrusters for the most part, and it already has guns on it too. In fact, I've got 4 rocket launchers, and I've got a couple Gatling guns on the top over here. Um, and I've got a couple extra thrusters that I'm pretty sure I don't need. Like I put these guys back over here. And I think this big center one would probably handle it anyway. But I've got wiggle room, and you know, a lot of this is like try to make things look kind of neat and whatnot. Of course, you know, the better function you can get out of stuff, the better. But I don't know. Overall, I'm pretty happy. Wow, holy smoke! Did you see that? Do you realize that in real life, if you took off this fast, it would probably break your neck? Check this out. Wow! Yeah. Okay, so this thing has some pretty good lift. It doesn't have enough generators in it right now because I didn't. It's totally test right now. It has some pretty good rotation this way, up, down, looking pretty good. And it's smooth, and I like that too. It's not jerking all over the place. It's a little twitchy yet, doing the roll, but it's just maybe overpowered. But then again, you know, a lot of this is a little bit of theory too, because of course with this I'm putting in more lift thrust again because it needs to support the weight of a tank or HV mounted to the bottom of it as well. Plus, I kind of wanted to get some storage in this thing too, so it's a little hard to figure out exactly how much thrust you need, and I think that just needs some trial and error to figure that out. I kind of, with the older system, I kind of got used to it. After enough builds, you kind of had a pretty good idea on how much thrust you're going to need for its tasks, especially with lifting cargo and things like that. Right now, I'm kind of a bit in a learning process yet again on what exactly do I need for a ship, you know, and that's fine because that's just going to take a little bit of trial and error and some practicing and some test chassis possibly just to figure it all out again, so I kind of know where I'm at. So I have a general idea when I'm building something on how much thrust I should put in it versus how big or how heavy I expect it to be. And one lesson I've learned from the past too is when you're first kind of like laying out a ship, like getting its shell kind of built or general chassis, I like to put more than I think I'm going to need in it because more often than not, I'm very happy I did later on. But by the time I finish off the ship and get all the interior in it, especially on a larger creation, it's going to weigh a lot more than what I'm looking at when I'm first testing it. And I've kind of, you know, I built a couple ships before where I didn't, you know, I thought I had enough thrust, but then by the time I finished up the ship, all of a sudden I realized that no, I don't have enough thrust, and it's a lot harder to add in more after the fact than it is to put it in when you're first building it. Worst case scenario, it's easy. Well, it's a lot easier to remove thrust than it is to add it typically in a ship. So that's basically where I'm at today. It's feeling pretty good about this now. In fact, getting this tank to work relatively easily. Now, granted, I had to sacrifice a little bit of thrust and the multi-turrets it had on it, but you know, it's a tank. The multi-turrets were really kind of getting into that dual purpose thing. And who knows, you know, with a little bit of more reconfiguration on this and some optimizing of other places of the tank, I could probably pop back in a multi-turret, and it probably doesn't need two as well. Yeah, seeing these numbers in that big hike in CPU limits at the higher tier, is making me really happy, because you know, at the lower tier stuff, you know, they're going to be smaller starter, cheaper ships anyway. And you know, like for instance, like the MX1 or MX2. These were kind of like, well, MX1 especially. This is like a starter ship. Of course, you know, it's got this dinky little interior. It's got some dinky little stuff going on. And I already know that if I remove the couple of RCS that this ship has, it actually has 3, that this ship is tier 1 CPU compliant. I've already made that test before. I don't believe the numbers changed much for the first tier. I think they gained a little bit going up to tier 2. Possibly, I thought it was like 12,000 and now it's 15,000. Tier 3 got a pretty big jump. I thought it was somewhere around 27,000, and Tier 4 got a really big jump. A little bit more than double what it was before on SV. So with all these new numbers and stuff, a lot of my issues that I was having are kind of diminishing. In fact, virtually gone. One thing I did want to check on, though, that I haven't looked at, I haven't really looked at part numbers yet to see, like, do these cost less CPU? And it doesn't look like they changed the numbers on here, but then again, when you got a max number that went to 10 million versus 1.6 million, it changes things drastically. Because 3 of these would be your entire CPU budget prior, where now it's not. So there's a big difference on that. So things are looking pretty good. I'm kind of motivated to build some new stuff again and to experiment with different stuff. There's some questions brought up about trying to get ships to pitch and roll and all that fun stuff without RCS. And here, let me do something real quick here, just to kind of show you how I believe things are working right now. So let's just quick build like a test chassis here a minute of a SV. This is my typical way I like to build things early on, is I don't build it right at where the core falls. I kind of build up and I start actually building the ship here, and I eventually blow away my pedestal. It just makes it easier so you can get to the bottom side of the ship and see what's going on and all that fun stuff. So I wanted to do a couple experiments here. Experiment number 1. Well, here, let me just make a viable chassis that can power up a second here. So here we'll add a couple of those and a couple of these. And let's throw in a cockpit. Let's get an open air one in here. And let me, while I'm at it, let me move the core right away to so keep in mind I'm in creative, and that's why this did not collapse on me or fall to the ground, I should say. And it won't until I get into the pilot seat. As soon as I do that, all bets are off, and it's going to then kind of respond to in-game physics. Alright, so test chassis here. First, the goal is not to run any RCS. Obviously, this can't fly right now. It's got no thrusters. So let me grab some thrusters here in a minute, and we'll just take these smaller 2-block ones, which is probably going to be way too much for the amount of, how heavy this is, which is very lightweight right now. And I wanted to see what would happen in different scenarios. So scenario 1, what I want to do is, what happens if you did have one thruster kind of centered in all directions? And this is just one of these experiments I've been curious about, to see what happens. My guess would be I wouldn't be able to turn this without RCS because of this, because I don't have that torque between thrusters. But again, I don't know exactly because I've never done this before. So there we go. Oh, wrong button. Let's turn off that. Alright, so obviously I can take off from the ground, and yeah, exactly as guessed, I've got 0 turning on this right now. And it looks like no, that is in rolling really, really sluggish on roll too. In fact, it kind of stops in the middle. So, not a good design whatsoever. Probably about the worst design you could do. So let's change some things real quick here. I'm going to get rid of the current thrusters. And I'm starting to believe that you're going to need 2 thrusters per direction as well. I don't think one's going to cut it necessarily. So I'm gonna change this around a little bit, and we're going to extend here. Actually, let me get symmetry back on real quick. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to build out some little arms out in these directions here. And here, let's build this up a little bit more and do the same kind of thing on the front. Now this obviously is a complete disaster to look at, but it's not meant to be pretty. All right. So in this scenario, what I want to do is, ooh, look at that reflection. Is put some thrusters on the edges of the ship. And this is a lot how the Martian Marauder was built as well. So we'll put a couple per side there. Let's put a couple in back. I don't have these perfectly centered over here right now either. Let's put a couple in front. And then we're going to need a couple on the bottom. Probably 4 on the bottom actually to make this work right. And typically with a lot of builds too, I might, at this point in time, I usually have more lift thrust than I have of any other thrust. Simply because of moving weight around and things like that. Alright, so new chassis. I didn't actually put any thrusters on the top row whatsoever, but there's some blocks up there to maybe offset the center of balance a little bit. And let's see what happens now. So now I can turn pretty well, and I can roll, and I can pitch, and everything else. Actually, yeah, the roll is pretty good. Actually, it's not too bad. So obviously, doing a lot of experiments on this, but this does seem like a much better layout, keeping your thrusters further out. And when they go down the center of gravity like that, especially if there's one, that doesn't work hardly at all. Now let's do another test. And this one here, what I want to do is not be as near as extreme with where my thruster placement is. So I've got these out on the outer edges currently. I'm going to go with the idea of having 2 thrusters per side yet, but I'm going to put them closer to the center of gravity, which I think would reduce its on how fast it turns and things like that, but to what extent I'm not sure yet. Lift thrust and whatnot. Let's try something different here. And then down thrust. I don't even know if I put down thrust in on the last version. Let me grab a couple more thrusters here in a sec. with down thrust too. Let's do something really different. Let's just put a couple in the middle like that. So, guesses on flight before I jump in the cockpit. I'm thinking it'll be similar. I think it'll turn just probably at a slower rate, a little bit slower rates on pitch and yaw with this, but I think it would also work. Well, let's find out. Yep, kind of about what I thought. It's working, but I'm getting lesser turning speed in pretty much all the directions. But it's not bad. It's just not as much. So, case in point, the further out, or the bigger the separation is between thrusters, the more turning you're going to get. And of course, like, let's just say, for instance, this is the center of gravity here. The further out I go with these thrusters on the edges, the more you're going to get with all those stats. But now here's a, uh-oh, darn it, it's doing it again. Shoot. Yeah, that I hope that this little occasional problem that I'm running into where things don't appear goes away. It's weird. There's another way actually too. Check this out. If I save it, and then I respawn it, those parts that or the changes I just made will show up again. Maybe. No, it just freaked out completely. Alright. So I'd have to restart the game at this point in time. But I think I kind of accomplished what I wanted to show you with a test on how this is working with turning and everything like that. So if you got a ship that's not like you don't have any roll or you don't have any pitch or yaw or anything like that, and it's not behaving well, basically if you were to get some thrusters on the outer edges, at least 2 per direction, and separated as much as you can in the design, you'll increase your stats with pitch, yaw, and roll without the need of using RCS. And that's kind of how the new flight model is designed. With some ships, like the Persis, I'm kind of lucky on. And oh, speaking of the Persis, I didn't actually take this up to fly it with all this going on here. So here's the Persis, and it's quite an agile ship. And there is no RCS in this thing at all, nor any changes in thruster placements. And honestly, it's well way too fast for a CV. I can't. I still find it kind of like I've always have, that it's easier to make a CV fly faster and stronger than it is to make an SV fly, which I think is kind of like a little bit opposite of on where I think it should be. I think the CVs should be generally slower, and SVs might be about right now, but CVs are kind of fast. Now granted, this one's running some pretty big thrusters on it, and that was done because of the past CPU iterations, but it does seem like they I don't know. It's hard to balance all this and to think on like what stats I think would need to be addressed to tame down some of this a little bit. And maybe it's just overall on like turning, because it's, you know, maybe a math equation like, hey, this ship is like X amount of blocks long and this wide and it weighs this much. And it's got this kind of thrust. I don't know. There's a lot of math there to figure out how to actually get all that tuned correctly to work with the new system. But it's still, to me, I love the fact that we've got the very increased CPU tier numbers at the higher levels. That makes a lot of sense. It allows a lot more creations, and not trashing everything that was built bigger in the past. But it seems awfully quick yet on CVs, and CVs I think ought to be slower in general as in vessels. Um, but like in this case, like because see that's a weird thing about this one too. It does not actually have any side thrust way up front here. In fact, the only side thrust I've got is back over here. So I'm kind of wondering if you don't need to have thrusters at the very edges, because I have no side thrust anywhere in this part of the ship whatsoever. Um, oh, hold on. Let's take out a couple of these side thrusters here a minute. So now we've only got one per side. And I have a feeling that won't create torque now. So I might have just screwed up my turning on this. But I didn't. Huh. I've got some more figuring out to do on this because it's turning quite well. In fact, all my directions are looking pretty good yet without those thrusters. And I also realize I totally don't need those extra thrusters there. In this case, removing those is not a big deal at all because I could fill that in and it wouldn't look too out of place, or just move that other one back. It's weird. This is a little bit puzzling on trying to figure out what's actually taking place here on why is it turning so good right now. And maybe it's getting torque from the other thrusters that are distributed throughout the ship. How about let's do something else that I think would hurt it badly on how it handles, but I'm going to take out the front two lift thrusters and just leave the back two. See what happens with that. I'm just trying to figure this out too, and so I kind of know the rules and general principles of it. It is a bit of a learning experience, and geez, that still didn't affect it. Huh. Guess these aren't quite the results I thought I was going to get on that. I thought by not having that separation, I was going to limit its turning speed. But it seems that I'm not, actually. So I will mess around on the side and try to figure out... Uh-oh, now it's doing this thing again. Well, these thrusters technically aren't here now. So I took out two of the back ones. Does that make a difference? Either. And then that many on the back. No, not really. Yeah. Well, it flies better than most SVs I ever built. So I think there's a little bit that needs to be tweaked with this yet, in this regard, with the flight model. It's kind of, CVs are getting a unfair advantage in handling, I think. But of course, I just took out like a bunch of the thrusters, so now look at my CPU. I've got a lot of room left now, and obviously it still flies super quick. So that means I've kind of run out of thrusters I can eliminate. Won't have much left if I take out more. But definitely liking all the improvements. It's kind of renewing energy to build. I'm now curious. I'm now excited to build again. And I hope that a lot of you feel the same way about the increase of the CPU. I think that was definitely one of the biggest issues I was having. Just knowing that, that limitation, like you can't build anything big anymore because it's too much CPU and blah, blah, blah. Of course, like I said all along, it's always optional, but it would be nice to build things that could comply to it. But if it was so limiting, that you could only build really small things that you're not very excited about, that's not too fun either. So I'm glad the numbers have increased significantly. I think it needs a little bit more work in the flight model yet because of the stats I'm seeing on this, which I'm puzzled on why I'm getting so much turning and speed on this yet. But I'm sure they'll get it and figure it out. I couldn't exactly tell you how to make the math work either, so it gets tricky, I'm sure. But even with like literally about half the thrusters that it had before, and immensely lower CPU levels, it's performing quite well. Too well. But anyway, that's all I got for today. I'm going to hit the drawing boards again and try to do some more learning and maybe come up with some better answers on how things are handling right now. I thought I had it kind of pegged with the SVs on, you know, where the thrusters go and whatnot, but the test on the CV here is proving that I don't fully understand what's going on yet. Because I'm getting results I would not expect. Anyway, y'all have a good day, and yeah, start building. All right, see you later.